Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me in this great event, Azure Community Conference. It's a pleasure to me to be here with you on this presentation. So let's start. Today we will talk about Azure Data Platform. Right? We're going to start with an introduction of what Azure Data Platform is, and we will discuss all the possibilities and options that we may find. A little bit about myself. My name is Javier Villegas. I work as IT director at Mediterranean Shipping Company. I am from Buenos Aires, Argentina, and I'm involved with SQL Server and the whole data platform since more than 25 years. My specialty is SQL Server administration, performance tuning, and high availability disaster recovery. I'm Microsoft MVP in the data platform category since 2016, and also I'm Microsoft certified trainer. I'm also a technical speaker. I love to share this kind of presentations for different communities around the world. So I'm member of the PAS community, and here in Argentina I'm also member of SQL Argentina team. We have our own meetup, and we have our meetings with the local community to discuss and share this kind of topics. On the left side of the screen, you will see my contact information, email, Twitter, LinkedIn, and my blog. In case you would like to ask me anything about this presentation, or if you just like to connect with me, I love to share and be connected when possible. So let's start the presentation. Azure Data Platform. The idea is to understand and know additional options that we may have in Azure, right? This way, knowing all the different components and services that we may have, we're gonna be able to take better decisions for our next projects, how to combine the different services, how to build a solution based on all the different possibilities that we have in the Azure cloud. So to start with, let's start with some grouping. I like to call them categories. So let's dig a little bit what these categories might be. So at the top left of the screen, you will see what I like to call the part that ingests our data into the solution that we're going to be building. Azure Data Factory is one of the most important components in Azure, which basically allow us to import and load data from more than 90 different data sources, right? In the Azure cloud, in another cloud, right? Or even on premises. Also, we can even perform ETL with transformation to then load it into our project. Then we have the databases, right? Databases engine, let's say. And here I just include two of them, just to divide in categories like SQL and NoSQL. We're going to have Azure SQL Database in one side, which is the transactional engine relational, and Azure Cosmos DB, which is the semi-structure schemaless option that we may have, right? We're gonna dig deeper a little bit later. Also, the solution for data warehouse. Initially, Azure Data Warehouse, still today, but this is also changing and evolving these days to another service called Azure Synapse Analytics, which is an evolution of the data warehouse in Azure. We also have the storage, right, with Azure Storage Account and Azure Data Lake. If we like to consider big data, we have Azure Data Lakes Analytics and also Azure HD Insight. And you will also see Azure Databricks. Pay attention on Azure Databricks because you will notice that it's more of one category, right? In this case, we're talking about big data. Also, again, at the left part of the screen, you will see Azure IoT Hubs, Kafka for Azure HD Insight, and Azure Event Hub. This is to start handling events and streams of events into our data platform project. We also have the components that allow us to process, right, stream data. So Azure Stream Analytics, again, Azure HD Insight, and Databricks. At the top right part of the screen, you will see Azure Analysis Services and Power BI. This is the components that allow us to prepare and present the data to that we are generating with our project, and also eventually can be the source of another project. We also have Azure Machine Learning with ML Server, and again Azure Databricks for the category that we can call machine learning. We're going to dig a little bit more about this, but these are the options that we have here. We also have bot services and cognitive services, which allow us to enrich all the data that we are capturing and processing in our project. Extremely important, Azure Search and Azure Data Catalog to understand a little bit more about what kind of data we are processing and hosting in our project. And then at the bottom part of the screen, you will see a set of services which are not data platform related. This is more like an Azure foundation for data platform and other services. For example, Azure Express Route to do the connectivity, Azure Active Directory for all the identities and authentication in Azure, as well as Azure Function, for example, right, which allow us to, again, move it and use it through different components within Azure. So now that we know the different categories, we can try to get like a big picture of what could be an architecture in Azure, what we're going to be calling the Azure Data Platform. Left part of the screen, again, we see the input, right? And when we talk about input, you will see that we have multiple options. At the top part, we have stream. Stream, we can get the stream through IoT devices, sensors, gadgets, any kind of device that will generate events, right? Also, we have non-structured data like images, video, audio, text, etc. And we can also have semi-structured and relational data. All this as source for our project. Then when we move to the right, we see the load and ingest part. At the top, Event Hub, again, to handle events. And at the bottom part, we're going to have Data Factory. Again, the service that allows us to ingest data to the next part of our project. Then we can store our data in Azure Data Lake, in this case Gen 2, and start also the processing part with our warehouse, right? In this case Azure Synapse Analytics. And when we move forward to processing, again, at the top part we see Stream Analytics, and then at the bottom we can have Azure Databricks, right? Also, we see in the picture cognitive services which allow us to, again, enrich the data that we are getting. when we move to the last part of our project that we can call it serve, we can see Power BI Premium, Cosmos DB, and Power BI Premium again, just to render the output, right, or present it for next step of our project. So these are some of the components that we will be focusing today, right? Data Factory, Data Lake, Synapse Analytics, Databricks, Cosmos DB, Cognitive Services, Event Hubs, Stream Analytics, and Power BI. So basically, these are going to be the main components of our project. When we go and deep a little bit more in the different kind of scenarios, we can consider traditional relational pipelines, for example, the same that we may have today in our environment serving our critical application, right? But in Azure, big data transformations, unstructured ingestion, and AI-based functions, right? And also serving inside data-driven application to enrich visualization. All this part that we make, working with Power BI Premium. And then when we dig into use case, right, we can go farther and consider an enterprise-wide data warehouse to produce and enrich and also process data for our project. So let's consider this particular case. This is a traditional environment in where we have transactional or relational database engine. We can call it SQL in this case, like generic. The warehouse, the analysis services, and the reporting. All this cross to an ETL process, right? We know this very well from the on-premise world, right? SQL Server, a warehouse, analysis services, and maybe integration services. We may see that we have these alternatives which are richer than what we have in on-prem because there are many more options. If we go to big data solution, we have the possibility again to work with events or stream data and also semi-structured data, right? So we have the ingestion part, processing, store, enrich, and reporting, right? So these components that we see through the Azure Data Platform will allow us to process any kind of solution that we may have today. Traditional OLTP environments, big data solutions, you name it. When we go and dig deeper in the different kind of options that we have, we can go and start with Azure SQL, right? Azure SQL is, we all know SQL Server, right? This is from, for example, from where I'm coming from. But in Azure, we have many more options. When we start to explore these options, we can find that initially we see SQL Server running on virtual machines, right? These virtual machines that are, in different OSs, Windows, Linux, etc. And then we see the possibility of running SQL as a managed service, right? The SQL Server running on virtual machines is what we call infrastructure as a service. We have to manage the infrastructure. We have to, let's say, take care of the operating system, the availability groups, if we need to do HADR, if we need to apply patches to both the OS and SQL, we have to do it manually, etc., etc., etc. Then on the other side, we have PaaS, platform as a service, right? In where the only thing we have to worry about is basically SQL. We're gonna get a SQL Server endpoint that we are going to connect with our application, Visual Studio, Management Studio, Visual Studio Core, or any other application. This option, Azure SQL Database, is the one that is in Azure since the very beginning. 2010 when Azure was presented. Of course, it has a lot of changes in that initial version, and it's extremely powerful. One of the most important characteristic of Azure SQL Database is that everything that you do has to be in one single user database, right? So for example, if in the on-prem world you have one application that have a store procedure which performs the several relationships in tables that resides on different user databases, well, you cannot do it with Azure SQL Database. It has to be all in the same user database. To, let's say, be able to support something more similar to what we know in SQL Server, then we have Azure SQL Database Managed Instance, which has all the components that we know from SQL Server Agent, Service Broker, Replication, you name it, right? But you have it as a managed service. Again, you don't need to worry about maintaining, administering, and handling the infrastructure, OS, patches, etc., etc., etc. Also, as part of the Azure SQL family, we have Azure SQL Database Edge, which allows us to run SQL Server on an ARM device, right? Like, for example, a Raspberry Pi. And, you won't be running your mission critical workload on a device like this using Azure SQL Database Edge Edition. But there are some edge scenarios in where definitely there are really, really good options. So this Azure SQL Database Edge is available in preview. So feel free to go connect and test it yourself in your environment. Definitely a good option for edge environment. If we start considering a little bit how we start working with all this, right, we consider a couple of options. The most common one is the Azure portal, right? Through the Azure portal, you just log in with your account, right? Then go to the Azure portal and you type to create a new resource Azure SQL. When you go through Azure SQL, you will see that the portal will propose these three options that we just saw: Azure SQL Database, Managed Instance, or SQL running on virtual machines. Right? A quick review till here: SQL Server on VMs, Infrastructure as a Services, Azure SQL Database, this single user database that allows us to host us with modern applications, and Managed Instance, which is more similar to what we know in SQL Server, but as a managed service. This is great, but what about if I don't work with SQL? I use another relational database engine. Well, Azure provides us with the possibility of running Azure SQL Database for Postgres, right? Postgres as a managed service. Again, one more time, we don't need to worry about the infrastructure, the patching, the high availability, etc., because Microsoft does everything for us in the background. Additional to PostgreSQL, we also have the possibility of having MariaDB as a managed service and MySQL, right? With all that, we have multiple open source options, right? Like different engines to run as a service. So then we can go to Azure Data Factory. Remember, in the architecture picture, this was the first part which allows us to ingest the data to our project. This is quite similar if you want to relate it to the on-prem world, to SQL Server integration services, right? But again, more like focuses on cloud data sources. So if we get this picture here, we see Data Factory at the center of the scene. Here we have the cloud data sources, right? And when I talk about cloud data sources, I mentioned it initially, we can consider again other vendors, and there are multiple data sources, like for example SAP, MongoDB, plain files, etc., etc., etc. Here, the destination is an Azure SQL Database Managed instance. But suppose that you need to go to your data center, right, in where you have a data source in there. I remember that not so long ago, I had to do a project to import data from an IBM AS400, right, this way, and I had absolutely no problem. There is this concept of gateway proxy, which is a piece of software that you install, which makes the possibility of having access from Azure Data Factory to your on-prem data source, right? So you can publish anything you have, and you can also execute your existing SSIS packages from Azure Data Factory using this technology. Then we have Azure Databricks, right? This is one of the components that I like a lot because you can use it in many parts of your project. This is basically Databricks, right? That Databricks is created based on Apache Spark, right? It's created by the people who initially designed Apache Spark, and that Databricks is the managed service for them. But then Azure or Microsoft in this case took Databricks, added into the Azure offerings, and the good part is that it integrates Databricks into the whole Azure stack, right? So you can have authentication through Azure Active Directory. You can have all the benefits of the security in Azure, right? All the sources, input and output that you have in Azure, all that include within Azure Databricks. So if we dig a little bit more in Azure Databricks, we see again that we may see all the different sources, stream, cloud-based storage, warehouse, big data, etc. And then through this collaborative workspace, we can make it available for different kind of users. Data engineer, data scientists, and business analysts can work together as a group using Databricks because each of them will have their own collaborative workspace, right? So we can integrate Databricks with a bunch of other sources, as I said, because it's part of Azure, right? And it's also heavily involved with multiple runtimes. Spark, of course, right? Because as we said, is based on Apache Spark. Definitely, is a great engine to work with machine learning, right? In when we can import different runtimes and work very easily through Databricks, right? So this is again an architecture example based on Azure Databricks, in where we import any kind of data. We can have it stored in Azure Data Lake, right? Import it and process it with Azure Databricks, right? And move forward to the serve part with any other option. Really important to consider is that you can work with several APIs, right? For example, you can work with R, SQL, Python, Scala, or Java. So doesn't matter which language you are familiar, you have all these options here, right? If you want to work in a SQL-like environment, you can, get your data frames and make the data that you import like a table, like a SQL table, and work with SQL. If you're more like a data engineer, data analysis side of the picture, you can easily work with other languages like R, Python, Scala, or Java. Right? So, interesting option to consider when we need to create all these collaborative environments. And then we also have Azure Analysis Services. I like to reference to Azure Analysis Services in the relationship that today we have with SQL Server on-premise and Azure SQL Database Managed Instance, right? The service, the software that we all know, SQL Server, and the managed service in Azure. The same is for analysis services, right? You know that SQL Server, the installer, comes with analysis services, and well, the managed service is Azure Analysis Services. It's extremely easy to migrate your existing tabular models, right, to Azure Analysis Services. You can easily connect Visual Studio or your SSDT projects on an Azure Analysis Service and work directly with that. And for us, the administrators, again, we don't need to worry about patching, high availability, backups, etc., because it's all part of the service. Of course, when you work with Azure Analysis Services, you may need to work with data sources that you have on-premise. And for that, Microsoft have a component called On-Premise Data Gateway. Right? This is a piece of software that you install in a dedicated host in your network, and then it gets registered into Azure. And what it allows us is from Analysis Services get this access directly to your sources on premises. On-premise data gateway is not only for Azure Analysis Services, it's also providing this bridge or gateway for other Azure components like Logic Apps, Power BI, Power Apps, and Flow. And you see, you can access any kind of source that you have on-premise, SQL Server, Analysis Services, another data source like, for example, any ODBC related, and also files, CSV files, or SharePoint. If we move forward, we go to Azure Cosmos DB. This is a globally distributed, extremely massive, scalable, multimodal database services, right? This is for example, what Microsoft used as the background of the Azure portal. It is extremely easy to distribute around around the world using the different, let's say, regions that Azure has. Right? You know that Microsoft has a bunch of data centers distributed around the world, which are these Azure regions, right? So we can easily distribute our models through the world, right? And with that, we can work with different APIs because, again, we have the possibility to work with structured data, semi-structured, document, and graph. And again, if we feel comfortable working with SQL, we can work it with SQL API, Mongo, Gremlin, Cassandra, right? So again, it's really easy to work with Azure's Cosmos DB. This is also interesting because you have multi-master options. So it's not only that you can read from multiple Azure regions around the world, but you can also write, right? And one of the most important thing is the low latency that you have here. So if you have a really huge deployment that you need to distribute and have presence in any kind of in any part of the world, definitely is a component to consider. Azure Cosmos DB. And then if we need to work with SQL, Azure SQL, or even Postgres, right? Microsoft has created this tool called Azure Data Studio, which is a multi-platform solution, so you can run it natively in Windows, Mac, and Linux, in where you can connect to your SQL environment, and as I said, other environments as well. If we need to work with Azure, the first interaction that we may have is through the Azure portal. In there, we just log in with our account and we start digging into all these components that we have in the project. So let's see some of them in action. Let me stop this. I will open a browser here, and let's start by going to portal.azure.com. Here I will log in with my account, and it's going to present me with all the different resources that I've been working recently. So let's say that I want to create an Azure SQL component. So I just go to Azure SQL. It's going to show me all the components that we already have created under this subscription or this login, right? And up here we have the option to add new ones. So when I hit add, here is what I showed you earlier in the slide. So if we go to SQL databases, right, we have here three options. Database servers, which is a logical grouping for the different Azure SQL database that we can create later, right? Single database. So we can have one database server and then underneath several user databases, right? But consider that again, each database has to be, like a unique group of resources and cannot interact with another database. Elastic pool is that when you have a set of resources in terms of DTU, what Microsoft called database transaction units, when you have to, let's say, grant resources to one of these Azure databases, right, in terms of CPU, memory, etc., right, you can have like a set of resources and then distribute dynamically to the different databases that you have. This is going to be useful, for example, when let's say you have one application that requires one of these Azure SQL database that, for example, is really busy during the night because it performs, ETLs or any workload that you can imagine. But then during the day is a little bit more like idle. Then on the other hand, you have another application that during the day is a little bit more busy because it's used by the different users, right? So again, you can dynamically move the resources to one database to and the other depending on a schedule, depending on the load, etc., etc., etc. Then you have the option of SQL database managed instance. Here we only have the possibility of creating a single instance, right? So again, when we go here and we hit create, it's going to show you, it's going to ask us with a couple of things, and we're going to create one instance. Let's check what we can do here. So let's hit create in this case, and something that you can consider here, and this is actually something that I like a lot, that doesn't matter which kind of resource you are creating in Azure, doesn't matter if it is for data platform related or any other, the process of creating that resource is quite similar, right? So the experience of creating resources in Azure is quite, similar from one service to the other. So let's go to create an Azure SQL database. First of all, you have to specify your subscription, right? And then a resource group. The resource group is this logical grouping of resources, right? You create this resource group and you can create multiple resources. Like, for example, if you are working on a data platform project, you can create one resource group and put all the components in there: SQL, Synapse Analytics, Data Factory, Databricks, etc. And you can have it grouped there, right? And eventually, if your project just finished and you need to get rid of all those components, you just go and remove the resource group. It's like a logical grouping. So let's use one of the existing one, for example, pass demo. Then it's gonna ask us with the name of the managed instance. Let's create it like AzConfDev2020. It's gonna check that it's not in use, so it's available, and then it's gonna ask us in which region we would like to deploy the resource. In this case, the managed instance, right? And then we're going to have the list of the list of regions in where managed instance is available. It's important to consider that, or actually is better if you have the resources deployed in an area on a region that is close to your location, right? The one in terms of network latency, right? So instead of having your resources at the other side of the world, just crossing all the world, it's better if you have it close to you. So in this case, I will choose US, East US. And then we have to specify the compute and storage. Something extremely important, not only for managed instance, but for most of the components in Azure, is that you have the possibility of doing a scale, right? So you define a set of compute and storage right now, but then there are some components that allow you to scale dynamically, another one static or manually, right? So let's say if you need more processor, if you need more memory, if you need more storage or faster storage, etc., etc., you can scale with a couple of clicks, right? So let's go here. We have, in this case, for managed instance, we have two tiers, what Microsoft calls general purpose or business critical, right? There is an important difference here in terms of the technology that is used through, in the storage. It's much faster, business critical, and also have additional replicas to do a scale of the read-only workload, right? Of course, it's a little bit more expensive. Don't pay attention of the numbers here. Those are expressed in Argentinian pesos. So you specify the numbers of vCores here that you would like to have in your managed instance, and then the amount of gigabyte that you want for your storage. If you have a Microsoft contract in where you already have licenses for SQL Server, right? You can use that license in a managed instance. So here you specify that you already have the license, right? You confirm here, and of course you have to pay less because you already have the license. Then you have another options to do the backup storage redundancy, if you want to share redundancy, etc., etc. I'm gonna hit apply here. Then it's gonna ask us with a default login and password, right? A sysadmin login and password. So we're gonna call, let's say, sa admin, and let's specify a password. Quite complex, it has to be. You have to repeat it. Right, when it's there, you have the green checker there, just to make sure that all is okay. Then you go to the networking part. You have to specify a VNet, or if there is no VNet, to create a new one, which kind of connectivity you have. Then in this case, managed instance have the possibility of present or not the endpoint to internet, right? Or just keep it private. By default is disabled, so it's only within Azure you can connect, right? You have to configure your VMs just to connect internally, or you can publish the endpoint to internet, right? Which kind of, or which version of TLS you're gonna be working with. Then for SQL Server in particular, you can specify the location, the collation, right? And also the time zone. So you can specify which is the time zone that you want your managed instance to be created with. So let's go with the one for Argentina. It should be here, city of Buenos Aires, right? In this case, if you want to have a sheer replication, meaning that you have your managed instance highly available in one zone, you saw we created in the East US region, right? If you have another one created, for example, in West US, you just go here and specify which one is, and it's going to do the replication automatically for you. Again, you don't need to worry about creating the window cluster, the Active Directory configuration to set up the availability group, etc., etc., etc. The service does everything for you. So then you can specify some tags, right? And finally, you have the possibility of review the whole configuration, and then the button to do creation, right? Note here something important, that for this type of resource, it is letting us know that it could take up to 6 hours to do the deployment. Here you can review the pricing, right? And eventually, let's say that you want to save the template, right, that you use. I mean, when you follow all this wizard, you create the managed instance based of you know, what all the things that we've been through, right? You can download the template to use it later, right? So you have it here and you can save it. Let's say if this is a resource that you need to create multiple of them, instead of just going through the wizard one by one, you create the template, and with PowerShell or through the Azure CLI, you can just run it using this template. So when it's ready, you just go and hit create, and it will do it. Of course, we won't do it now because it's going to take a long time. We're going to see one in action in a minute. Then we have SQL Server virtual machines, right? In where, you know, here the list, this is an image. What Microsoft called with image is a combination of different operating systems and SQL servers version and editions, right? So if we go through the list here, we can see from SQL Server 2019 on Windows Server 2019, Developer Edition, Standard, Enterprise, and then the possibility of bringing your own license. But then if we go down, you see that, for example, we have here the option of SQL Server 2019 and Red Hat Linux 7.4, Ubuntu, SUSE, then SQL Server 2017, and then we can go up to if we go down through the list, we can even go to SQL Server 2016, 14, 2012, and even SQL Server 2008 R2 running on Windows Server 2008 R2. Hopefully nobody has to use this day, but it is available. So what can we do now? Okay, let's go to the managed instance that I already have created. So I go to Azure SQL, I go to my managed instance, right? And again, this experience is quite similar to all the other resources in Azure. So here in the dashboard, we have, for example, all the databases that we have in the managed instance. We also have certain metrics that we can get and have access from the portal, like for example CPU utilization, storage utilization, and few other things. Right here at the top, we had how we can connect to the host, the connection string, the pricing tier, and the resource group. Then, for example, let's say we need to scale this particular managed instance. We go here under setting, compute and storage, and here we can change from one tier to the other, or we can, eventually, if we need to scale, adding additional vCores, which is go here, right? And it's going to give us how much we have to pay, and when we hit apply, it's going to create it for us. It's going to do the scale. Then integration with Azure Active Directory. From here, the failover group, again, what we say, if we need to do a shear replication between two zones, right? From here we just select the zone and we do it directly from here. More metrics, right? If we need to collect average CPU usage, if we need to add more let's say storage level, like IO request count, here we can modify here the time range, last 24 hours, last 30 days, in which time we want to see it, in GMT UTC format or our local time, etc, etc. So quite powerful. And again, we can do this for this resource and many others. We also have diagnostic settings here, right? So we can create additional logs, right? And we can even, eventually, if we need to open a request support, a ticket with Microsoft, we do it directly from here, right? How do we connect to this managed instance? Okay, I will open Azure Data Studio here. Let me see. Azure Data Studio, and when we open Azure Data Studio, it's going to take 1 second. Okay, here is my Azure Data Studio. I'm using an insider version right now, right? It's the one that we can use to test upcoming features. But again, see here, I'm connected to the SQL, to the managed instance endpoint, right? Directly from Azure Data Studio. Again, remember, Azure Data Studio, the application that we use to connect to SQL in this case, right? Which is a multi-platform, right? So here I'm connected to this managed instance through my computer without any problem. So this was a quick introduction to the Azure Data Platform. Again, the idea is just to know the categories, the components, so we know them and we can have additional options to use in our next project in the cloud. Thank you so much. If you have any question, please reach me through my contact. Don't doubt to connect with me, and thank you so much. Have a good day. Bye.